Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Prezi webinar. My name is Arwen Heredia. I am Prezi's Content Marketing Manager and your moderator for today's session. We're here for the second in our brand new series on conversational storytelling for business. And today, we're going to talk about marketing. We're going to talk about memorability, engagement, and messaging, and how to really make those marketing messages resonate with the people that you're trying to reach. We're here with Spencer Waldron. It's Prezi's Director of Regional Marketing in Europe. Before we get started with Spencer, I just want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions for myself or for today's host, please head over to your Q&A chat box, typically located on the top left or bottom left of your screen. And we will be sending a follow-up that includes a recording to today's session, as well as access to the Prezi presentation that Spencer is going to share with us today. We also will send some information to you if you want to check out the session we did last time for sales, or check out our future session coming up on conversational storytelling for the internal pitch. So once again, we're here with Spencer Waldron. Thank you so much for joining us today, Spencer. Let's get going.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So today we're going to talk a bit about storytelling specifically for marketing people. And I'm going to cover three things that I think are going to be really useful, hopefully. The first is what we can learn from some of the companies out there that have been doing this for decades. And that I'm going to share with you two things that they do that are probably different to what a lot of other companies out there do, and what we can learn from it. The second thing I'm going to share is how you can build up a emotional map, if you like, of your various different audiences. And I'm going to share with you some tools that you can use to do that. And the third thing is to talk a little bit about how you can deliver your stories, or how you can tell your stories. And I want to cover two things there, again, which I think might change how you see how you kind of deliver the stories. So with that, we'll start with who's doing great stuff in the world of storytelling out there. And I think, storytelling in business is not something new. There are companies that have been doing this well for decades. And I think, obviously at the moment it feels like it's become much more of a popular thing as I guess a reaction against, how much, I call it this war on attention, where everybody's trying to get 2 minutes of your customer's day. And story represents a way to help cut through that noise. But when you look at the companies that do amazing things with storytelling, they do two things that are different. The first is that they see story as a strategy, not just a tool, not just something that you use for a marketing campaign. They do that, but it's not the only thing. So that's the first difference, is a lot of companies will make product decisions, HR decisions, who they work with as partners, all based around this single story that acts as like a North Star. So that's something that we can think about. It may already be happening in your organization, or it might be like the beginning of the journey for storytelling at your organization. But that's definitely something to have in the back of our minds. The second thing is that they use story not to sell product, but they use it to sell possibilities. The possibility of, what they do for their audience, of what their audience's life can be like, or what their audience can achieve. So if we start with looking at Lego, Lego is one of my favorites because I have two young boys. And, I took them to see this Lego movie when it came out a few years ago. And the whole of the movie is based around this central character called Emmett, who, you see, who goes from being told or feeling that he can't build anything out of Lego to that he's like this master builder of Lego. And that's the message to the children in the cinema. And it's certainly a message that my kids picked up. The first thing they did after that movie was run home, dust off the Lego, and proudly emerge from the room 2 hours later, showing me what they've built. And that's the kind of core possibility that they create, that, as a child, you are only limited by your imagination. And it's kind of powerful stuff. What they don't do is talk to the kids around, how great the bricks are and what they're made of, and don't they fit together just perfectly. because that's not inspiring. That's not a story based in the possibility. And it's also a bit why, if you go into a toy store now, you can hold up a box of Lego and there's an augmented reality machine that shows the final product, the built product. Again, it reinforces to the child that they can finish and build that amazing piece of Lego. So being a master builder is their kind of core possibility. And if you look at Nike, I'm a runner. That's my passion, has been for many, many years. And the same thing, Nike will never really talk to me about the shoe and what it's made of and how great it is. In the beginning, they will only talk to me about, that I can be a better athlete. That's the possibility that they create for me, that I can run a little bit further or a little bit faster, or maybe I could even run my first marathon. And it's the same with every sport that they're active in. The focus is how to be a better athlete. And that's something that when you look at it, the same as with Lego, is that also influences their product decisions amongst lots of other things. So I'm sure everybody will recognize this text from Apple. And I think, this is from the Think Different campaign in '97. But again, it's one of the best examples from Apple where they focus on their core possibility, which is you can change the world with the work that you do. So again, it's all about the possibility that you create for your customers. And then if you look at GE, and what they do when they talk about the jet engine, again, they don't talk about the product and the specifications. They talk about the fact that it puts fewer emissions into the atmosphere, because that's what the airlines care about. So when you're thinking about your stories, then really start to think about what's the core possibility that you create for your audiences. So connected to that, let's look at a bit about how we can build up this emotional map, if you like, of who your audience is. So sticking with, what's the possibility that you create. Now, maybe you already know what this is. Maybe you're even talking about it. Maybe it's something that you want to think about. And either way, there are 5 questions that I think help you to kind of formulate this, which is the ones that you see on the screen. Because when you start to once you start to put yourself in the mind of your different types of audiences and ask these kinds of questions related to how they feel about things, it starts to give you very different answers. So for example, I'll use Apple as an example. So imagine I'm somebody who wants to be in a music band or a rock star. I desire to be a rock star and famous for my music. And seeing how the crowd reacts to us when we're singing makes me really delighted. And the fact that I can do post-production of our music on a computer fills me with a sense of wonder. And I'm striving to understand how to do that better. And I'm passionate about, producing the best music possible. So whatever it is, whatever the subject matter is that you are connected to in your organization, start trying to answer those questions in different ways. And that will probably give you some clues to what the possibility is that you can start to kind of, not only build your stories around, but maybe even start building the strategy around. And you can take it a bit further, because if you think about the customer journey that somebody does with you, if you look at that from a feelings point of view, again, that starts to give you lots of interesting insights. So the 15 or so questions you see on the screen there, and you'll get a copy of this Prezi, so you'll get access to this afterwards. But this actually, first of all, it's really good for your customer journey or customer service people to have this anyway. But for you as a storyteller, it's also really important, because it gives you clues to different stories that you might need to tell. Because if we stick with the person who wants to be in the music band and they're thinking about buying an Apple computer, for example, you might answer these in the way that's, I'm really excited about receiving that box with my new computer in it and being able to do great things for my music. but I'm daunted by understanding how to use it. And I really dread having to read the instructions, and I'm relieved to maybe find that I can watch a video instead or have somebody show me in the store. So when you go through these kind of questions, you really, again, start tapping into how people feel about the process of what they're trying to do, which sometimes can give you some really good ideas in terms of how you're going to, or what kind of stories you're going to tell. So another thing that's useful to use is empathy maps. And you can just Google empathy maps and you'll find a ton of stuff about them. And what you do is you do an empathy map for each of your customer types, and you start answering a few questions. So the first one is, what are the tasks that they're trying to complete? What questions do they have about them? And what influences them? What people or places or blogs influence, kind of where your audience goes to get information. How do they feel about the tasks that are important to that they have to do, and what's important to them? And then the classic pain and gain type questions. But again, this is like an interesting tool just to build up a picture of what their life's like, and then to be able to overlay some of the feelings elements to it as well. So those questions and empathy maps are two tools that I've used a lot that can be really, really powerful. So let's dig a bit deeper into emotions, because, there is no persuasion without emotion. Emotions, we've proven that emotions drive decisions. There's been, countless studies that have looked at this, and and our knowledge is deepening as time goes on, and I think some of the things that we've just covered about discovering what those emotional triggers are become really important, because if you look at how people make decisions, then there's two elements to that. You have to make an emotional connection with somebody first, which is why when companies build their whole strategy around the possibility that they create for their audiences, it can end up adding a lot to the bottom line. But it's very much around, you need to make that emotional connection by painting a picture of the future that they want to get to. In storytelling, we call this the promised land, or the possibility that you create for your user. But what do they desire? What's that place in the future they want to get to? Because that's what inspires. That's what makes the emotional connection. And as we're talking about in a minute, that it activates a completely different part of the brain to the second part of a decision, which is trust. And trust, for us, is about evidence. So emotion is all about telling stories, which activates one part of the brain, and evidence is what you can use to kind of build trust. Because, if you're given a presentation, for example, and, you can show somebody this nice sunny place in the future that you're going to take them to, but they don't trust you yet that A, that it's possible, or B, that you're the person to get them there. So that's when you need to start bringing evidence into the picture, and that can be data and charts, it can be case studies, it can be many different things. But those two elements together are what make it easier for somebody to make a decision in your favor, which at the end of the day is what we're trying to do. So let's look a little bit about how the brain works, because that helps us understand why story is important and its place in what we're doing. So our brain works a little bit like this cross section from a tree trunk, where the inner rings represent the early days of the tree, and the outer rings represent the tree as it's grown and evolved over time. And that's how our brains have evolved. It's a bit like in archaeology when they suddenly discover the ruins of a city underneath an existing city. And it's the same with how our brain works. So we have different sections of the brain that do different things. So our modern brain, which is called the cerebral cortex, this is like our thinking brain. This is where our conscious thought happens. And it's where we generate our feelings. And the important thing to understand is that emotion and feelings are two different things. So emotions are a set of instructions that your body carries out without you even knowing it. And that can be that your heart starts to race faster, your palms might sweat, endorphins or adrenaline might be, kind of sent into overdrive in your body. Whereas feelings are how we interpret that physiological thing that's going on in our body. And this is important to understand, because this is what drives decision making. So the modern brain, like we said, that's where our conscious thought happens. And then we have two areas of the brain that are connected to emotions. So the first one is the limbic system, and the second one is the cerebellum. And both of these areas, and they're both kind of more ancient brain structures. And a lot of it is unconscious thought. So it's stuff that happens without us realizing it. And when you look at our most basic emotional response, which is survival, that was really around danger. Do I run away or do I fight? And opportunities was normally about food or sex. And those responses we still have today. If you tell a story that's based on an opportunity that they really want, they'll have the same physiological response and the same things that trigger in the brain. And this is why it's really important for us to connect on an emotional level, because it's a really powerful persuasion tool, if you like. So how, if you think about how it manifests itself, then, it's obviously a bit of a funny picture, but it illustrates the point that if you suddenly opened the door of the microwave, or you opened a kitchen drawer and there was a spider there, the first thing you might do is recoil backwards, and your heart will probably beat a little bit faster before you realize that, no, you don't have to worry, it's only a spider, or it wasn't a spider in the first place. But that's the emotion that happens, and that happens before your conscious brain thinks, okay, this is what's going on, and then I make that rational decision. So the emotional part of story is really important, because that's what activates everything else. And then our conscious brain, that modern brain, is where we have the logical thought. That's where we decide, okay, is this a good idea? Should I do business with this company, or should I run away from that spider? But the two things together are really important. So we can start to think about this in different ways when we come to thinking about, okay, how do we choose a theme for our story? So there are 6 emotions. There is some debate on whether there's actually 4, because disgusted and surprised may actually have a very similar physical response in our body. But for our purposes, we'll stick with the 6. So angry, disgusted, afraid, happy, sad, surprised. Now, what you have for those 6 emotions, each one of those has lots of different feelings, which, just for a bit of fun, I put into this periodic table of emotions. Don't take it too seriously, but it's a good way to visualize it. And I won't go through all of these, because again, you'll get a copy of it. But if I was just to say, zoom in a bit to happy, then, if you have a story around, being content, or somebody supporting each other, or hope, or kindness, or love, or understanding, or confidence, then all of those types of stories will have the same emotional, physical response in our body, which is happy. And what you can do is you can start to combine 2 different feelings, or 2 different emotions, in your story. And one of the really powerful ways that you can do this, and I've seen this used a lot with charities, with businesses, where you go from sad to happy. So from the blue squares to the green squares. And we'll talk a bit about, like, when we talk about story delivery, how you can amplify this. But that becomes really powerful, because, sadness is actually a very strong emotion. And like, if we watch something that makes us emotional and our eyes start to tear up, that's something that our brain remembers, the same as happy. So you can start to play around with, maybe I have a story that's based around somebody being tired and a bit despairing, but then moves into somebody supports them, and it's a story of hope. So there's a huge amount, like a huge emotional range there that you can take people through. That will kind of be something that people kind of remember next time they come to think of, your company, your brand, your organization. So let's look a little bit at story delivery and how we tell our stories. So, if you look at this cup of coffee, and I'm sure there's a few of you listening today that, love coffee as much as I do. A cup of coffee is actually really rich storytelling ground. If you think when you walk into a cafe, you'll be hit by the smell of the coffee. And the next thing is you'll probably hear the coffee grounds in the machine being ground up for the cup of coffee. And you'll hear conversation around you. And maybe you've come from outside where it's cold and it's nice and warm inside. And you get given this cup of coffee, which has amazing artwork on it. And, you take the first sip of the coffee and you think, this is what I needed. This is what I wanted to have. So when you think about that and about all the different senses that are at play, this is something that's really important for us, because what we're also beginning to learn is that sight, sounds, and smells actually create emotional memories. Which again are really important for us because we want people to remember our stories, because again, if we're looking at it, what we're really trying to do is in the future, when somebody's at a purchase decision, that they can recall these kind of emotional memories and stories. That's why when I walk past a cafe on a cold day, I'll remember the feeling of going in there and having that amazing cup of coffee. And it's the same with the stories that we tell. But on top of that, it's worth thinking about what else can we add in terms of other senses to our stories? Because most of the time now we tell our stories online, and actually we tend to do it through voice, through a lot of text, and increasingly through video. And what I wanted to do is just pick up on music, because music is really powerful. And if you look at some of the examples of storytelling that's done really well, music actually plays a big part of it, because, music completely changes our mood. And you can do that in your stories. It won't, probably won't be all the time, but again, I think there's a lot of times where, you can use that. Because music also activates part of our brain that's linked to emotion and memory. So it's definitely a tool that you should have in the toolbox. And, there's lots of examples of this, like if I use as a case study quite a lot, there's an organization called Charity Water. And they have this amazing video called The Spring, which is 20 minutes of a video. And it's one of the best examples of storytelling I think I've seen. And, that's a story where the first 10 minutes, the dominant story theme is sadness. And the second 10 minutes, the dominant theme is happiness. And they use music in the same way. So for the first 10 minutes, there is a piece of music that gives you a feeling of somberness or sadness a little bit. And then at minute 10 or minute 11, it completely switches to happiness. And that's something that has quite a profound effect on you. And if you go and Google any of those two things, if you go and Google film director quote music, you'll be able to see how film directors talk about the power of music in movies and how that connects to people on an emotional level. And another one that I would get you to go and watch is a commercial that Google India created called Reunion. And that's probably the best example I've ever found of using real intense emotion in a commercial that actually places Google product in it all the time, but it works really, really well. But again, think about how when you start looking at stories that people tell, listen to the music and think about how that makes you feel on top of what you're hearing in terms of the rest of the story dialogue or seeing and things like that. But again, so music is this emotional language that has a big impact. So if it's relevant, then think about how you might want to use it. And just as a tool that I've used in the past, Audio Jungle is a pretty good place to go find music. But again, there's lots of different things out there. So the second thing I wanted to talk about story delivery is about respecting the platform, because what a lot of people do is, we'll create this amazing story and then we'll go and tell the same story in the same way on every platform. And actually, we need to kind of respect the platform. So if, for example, I'm on YouTube, then when I'm on YouTube, I'm in a mood to be either entertained or educated because I'm there, I want to learn something. So actually, when I'm on YouTube, I'm quite happy to consume longer pieces of content because that's the frame of mind that I'm in. So the example you see on the screen is the equality campaign that Nike did recently. I think it was about 6 months ago. And if you go to YouTube, you'll see the full video. You can see the behind the scenes because you're in that mood where you want to kind of, get into it in a deeper way. But if you look at Twitter, Twitter now is more or less about having one-on-one conversations and debates and things like that. So that's what they did on Twitter. And the same with Instagram. If you go on Instagram, at the core of Instagram is I go there to see inspirational photography. And, increasingly with Instagram stories, the kind of micro stories that people tell. So again, you're not going to show, a 10, 20-minute video. You're going to do a micro story version of that, which again is something that, Nike do really well. And I thought I'll just give you a few examples that they've done. Obviously, Facebook, again, you talk about stuff as more of a community and you get more kind of interaction. So, going back to what I said about me being a passionate runner, then that's, that on that micro story on the left is something that speaks to me as a runner because, I want to be that woman effortlessly jumping over that fence in this beautiful place running, the sun coming up or going down. And, the text that goes with it, it's a fence, not a finish line, is again, just this amazing kind of micro storytelling where, if you go to somewhere else, you'll see a much more in-depth version of that. So again, think about, how you tell your story on different platforms and think about what do people want, when they're on that platform, what are they looking for? So that's about it from me, just to have a bit of a wrap up, to go over some of the stuff that we talk about. So, remember, really try and understand what's the possibility that you create for your audience. Build up this emotional map, start it and it will change over time. And, as you learn more and speak to more customers and, spend time with the customer services team, spend time with the sales team, and just keep building up this emotional map of what drives people. And think about, if people make decisions using emotion and trust, what are the various elements that you can show to people that, kind of help in the decision process? Think about what is the dominant story theme that you want to choose. And, obviously use different senses when you deliver the story. So that's it from me. I hope that was useful. And I'm happy to take any questions. So back over to Arwen.
Oh, thank you so much, Spencer. That was really awesome. And as a marketer myself, this is super useful for me. So I'm going to be revisiting this content for sure. We do have some questions coming in. So we're going to start with Bethany. She would like to know if your approach to storytelling changes between something like B2B messaging versus consumer marketing. So you had a couple of examples in there of consumer, but how does this change if you're talking to a business instead?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, there's definitely this feeling, and, I've been through this myself because I've worked in both B2B and B2C, that it's much harder to do storytelling in B2B. But there's plenty of examples of it working. And I think, going back to the GE example, this is a really great example to look at because, GE is a company that is, has a lot of different verticals that are very traditional B2B environments in a lot of ways. And they found really creative ways to tell stories that resonate. And I think when at the core of it is that it doesn't matter what industry you're in or what your job is, you have a passion about that somewhere. If I take the example of one of the things I read about GE was they have this software for airports which manages, traffic in and out of the airport. And, there is a beauty and an elegance and a passion in what they do for their job. They care about doing their job well and keeping people safe and maximizing traffic in and out of the, of the airport. So there are stories that you can tell that directly tap into the passion that they have for the job or the work that they're doing. And I've even seen examples of, I'll stay with the GE example, but, I've seen examples of where they're trying to tell stories about hydraulic braking systems, which is probably among the harder subjects to try and do storytelling about. But if you go and look at what they do on Vine, they do these amazing 6-second stories where, they'll show the effect of hydraulic braking in a way that you just go, that's pretty cool. So I think it's always possible. It's, I think, for sure harder in B2B, but I think it's definitely possible. And I think, the first step is just that deep understanding of what's the emotions going on, what are the feelings that people have about the work that they do and the outcome that work has. Because I think if you base your stories around that, then you won't go wrong. But a really great question, and it's something that we all feel.
Excellent. And speaking of emotions, what a great lead-in. Ranjay is talking about your periodic table of emotions and is wondering what the riskiest emotion to try touching on with marketing is.
That's a really insightful question. The most dangerous emotion. I think, let's define danger. I guess danger is what you don't want is people to have a bad feeling about your brand.
Sure.
So, that for me would be at the core of it, because, it could be that there's a story which is based on, some kind of feeling that would drive a happy emotion, but actually it still might paint, your brand in a bad light. So I think that's got to be for sure at the core of it. But, my personal view is, I stay away from the left-hand side of that table, which is all the angry emotions, because I've never really seen, outside of politics maybe, where anger, kind of is a useful emotion to have in somebody. You can do it to a certain degree. I think that's the other thing is that, and that's what I was trying to do with that table, is that, you can evoke the emotion of anger somebody in many different ways, some very subtle, some very intense. So again, yeah, my personal view is I would stay away from, the anger type of stuff. But all of the others, I think, as long as you do it in a way that's sensitive and adds value to the person that you're talking to and inspires the person that you're talking to, then I don't think you'll go too wrong. I think it's just don't try and get an emotional response for the sake of getting it. I think it's, you need to have that understanding of what's the emotional journey that your customer is on in relation to what they do that's connected to your product or your brand, and just, have a sensitive use of how you use emotion. And I think, I've heard somebody else say this in the past, and I've always had it in my head that, as long as you're doing something that adds value and is positive for both you and your customer, then you won't go wrong. But yeah, good question.
Right, great advice. Cool. So Sarah is wondering if you have, and I like this question because this is something I personally face all the time as a content marketer. Any tips for using this approach or things to consider when you're doing something like an email campaign versus something like a bus ad that people see very, very quickly and probably will never see again? They can't retain that, but the email they could go back to over and over.
Yep. I'm enjoying this question as well. I think, when it comes to an email, again, it's back to this war on attention. We need to remember in the back of our heads that every person that we want to talk to has at least 150 other people wanting to talk to them that day. And we have become incredibly good at scan reading stuff and looking at stuff in a glance and working out, should I give my attention to this? Because I only have so much attention each day, and I'm now becoming really protective of who I give it to, because A, a lot of people will waste my attention, and B, I can't possibly take everything in. There's just too much stuff out there now. Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing that they read, or the first thing that they should see, is something that taps into emotion. Because, you know, if we go back to, you know, why do you send somebody an email, or why do you put something on the side of the bus? It's because you want them to make a decision. It's because you want to change the way they think about something. So a lot of the time that's around, here's this bright place in the future that you can get to. And here's maybe, you know, 3 things why that's true. Now, on the side of a bus, you're not going to have time to do that. You're going to have time to do one thing and one thing only. Whereas with an email, what I would start to think about is, you know, you have one main point, which is the first thing that they see, which taps into this, you know, emotional place in the future, or the possibility that you're creating for them with whatever it is that you want to say. And then 3 very succinct supporting arguments that then link out to further detail if they want to go and get further detail. But again, I think it's around, you know, it's also about, have you built up trust that you don't waste their attention? Because I think that's something that's becoming super critical these days. But yeah, great question.
Really good point. The trust aspect of it. We don't want to waste people's time. Don't want to bombard them with 50 different messages a week, or they'll stop opening our emails altogether. So a question from Dan. This is the last question I'm going to visit today, you guys. Wonderful questions coming in, so thank you so much for that. But I like this question. What is the biggest marketing fail you have ever seen?
The biggest marketing fail that I've ever seen. That's a great question. I'm trying to think. I've seen things that are not spectacular fails, but things that don't work that well. And I won't name any names, but I've seen storytelling recently where the product or the brand, you can tell that it's just been like almost shoehorned into the story. And I think where it works really well is where the product is part of the story. It's not the main point, but it's there in the background. And that's something that's both a subtle art form, but something that needs thought, because, you know, our temptation is always to, you know, talk about us. And there's always this kind of gap between the stories that we want to tell and the stories that our audiences need or want to hear. And I think where the elegance and the beauty comes is where you find a way to tell a story that your audience wants or needs to hear. And by almost happy circumstance, your product and brand is part of that story in the background. And it's wrapped in this, you know, possibility that you create. So I think that's where I've seen stuff backfire. I mean, I've also seen stuff where people come at things, you know, people have tried to do stuff around sensitive subjects, and they've come at it with, you know, the right intentions, but the execution just didn't work, and then they get a backlash. So, you know, if you're going to do anything around politics or race or age or sex or whatever it is, then that, you know, tread carefully. Because, you know, you can have the best intentions in the world, but something small changes in the execution, or, you know, it's not easy. And if it's something that's like at the core of what you do, then sure, that's something that you need to get good at. But, you know, normally those kind of things I would, you know, stay clear of unless it's super important to do, or it's, you know, super important to the values of your company. But yeah, really good question.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Spencer, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us today and stuck it through to the end. Wonderful questions today, really great content. So stay tuned for information on how to register for the third and final session. If you're interested, the content will be very similar, but we'll be focusing on the internal pitch and how to persuade decision makers and people with the budget to back your projects and that kind of thing. So once again, thanks everybody. I hope you have an awesome rest of your week. And thanks, Spencer, for joining us today.
You're welcome. Good to be here.